Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and Redbridge's Samaras. Each fortnight, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations with leaders, activists, and thinkers from the world of Australian and global politics, culture, and ideas. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Curtin's Cast. I'm Nick Dyrenfurth, Executive Director of the JCRC, co-host of Curtin's Cast, along with my great mates, Cos Kung Fu Samaras, Director of Redbridge Group and a board member of the JCRC. Good morning, Cos.
Good morning.
How are you, mate? You've been in my thoughts, and I've just been wondering, we're at 5 weeks from the federal election. I've seen a couple of polls pop up here and there. I'm just wondering, are you experiencing any sort of withdrawal effects from the election and the lack of polls to digest and to analyse?
Well, not really, because my day job is actually looking at data all the time. So, and data that applies to the corporate and non-for-profit sector. So, no, I'm full of data at the moment.
Good to hear. We still haven't seen any graphs from you, Cos. I'm very disappointed. You've been digesting a lot of data from the recent federal election. I know you've been keeping an eye on the UK local government elections, which have produced some very, very interesting results. And you're coming up with a very interesting thesis that we're going to explore in some depth today around some of the generational divides, which have been a repetitive theme on Curtin's Cast, and much discussion in the mainstream media, legacy media and non-legacy media. I have to say I've read a few articles recently, including in The Economist this week, which described your generation and my generation, Generation X, although I'm a cusp millennial, we're the losers. But you've got an interesting thesis about Gen Y, millennials, and Gen Z, and their disruptive nature vis-a-vis the baby boomers. And in fact, it's now the best way to understand Gen Y and Z put together is as that disruptive baby boomer force, which took root in post-war, particularly post-war Western societies. Do you want to explain where you're up to?
Okay, so the way we're going to look at this is what impact did baby boomers have on Western society? Let's just focus on this country, but we can go a bit more broader than that. The first thing we saw was obviously when they, obviously the boom of that generation. You had an explosion of daycare centres, an explosion of construction of new schools. You had a whole range of industries that were born out of basically accommodating this huge influx of young children. Then you follow from that, you've had basically since, as they come of age, they probably peaked in the 1980s, and that obviously was a very transformative decade in many ways, from advertising, media consumption, the way news was formatted.
And prior to that, of course, in the 60s and 70s, you have the expansion of tertiary education as well. Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah, but true. But
if
you look at baby boomers, their education levels are still very, very low compared to the rest of the population. What we do see, though, is significant changes in the way Western society functioned and developed. So they were a massively disruptive generation, and they helped build a number of different industries. Those industries are now going to hit very turbulent times because, there was an article, for example, on the weekend how TAB, for example, it has to change its business model in terms of how it partners and co-funds pubs and clubs in this country because revenue is down. Well, the reason why revenue is down is because those establishments, those institutions are frequented by baby boomers. It's a form of betting and recreation, whether it's pokies, whether it's, on in-person betting, that the boomer generation got very, very much used to and still participates in. But it's not a form of betting and gambling that Millennial and Gen Z get into. They are very much online. They don't leave their home to do it, right? And so you've got that disruptive nature. You have TV revenue, advertising, free-to-air, down massively. We're seeing programs get axed because they can't get the eyeballs. The project, for example, on Channel 10 was just recently...
I saw that, big news yesterday.
Got poleaxed because it's not getting enough eyeballs. Now, that show was originally designed to attract younger people. I may say that
we're getting old because...
well, their format was very much really still designed to appeal to a baby boomer generation and to a certain extent Gen Xers. It was still free-to-air format, TV advertising in the middle, 2 or 3 advertising slots per hour program. Lo and behold, didn't work, right? It doesn't work with this generation because they're not watching TVs. The production of TV sets. So if you look at particularly in Western countries, the tendency of making money by selling TV is going to obviously become more and more riddled with problems because Gen Z don't buy TVs. They more likely will watch what they watch on their tablets, laptops. They are decoupled from the desk, so to speak, or decoupled from the couch when it comes to viewing habits.
Yeah, so, yesterday, I did an interview on Sky News yesterday, and this is, I did it on my laptop. I don't have to go into a studio. I do it on the laptop. Just want to let's just step back for a moment. I want to talk about it, but before we move into this kind of revolutionary generation, just want to step back and just talk about the boomers. They're often known for their sort of cultural and social rebellion, and it's often understood as sort of rebelling against their parents. Just take us through their political influence and their voting habits, because it doesn't quite match up with the stereotype of sort of young, cultural rebels, but really, and particularly, we've talked about the John Howard influence on Australian politics. They seem to have become more conservative in their voting habits, which is the kind of traditional understanding of how people, as they age, they shift from left to right.
Boomers obviously triggered a cultural revolution, and the younger generations that we're talking about are triggering a revolution against the establishment. Right, so they're two very different seismic events. With boomers, they were more progressive when they were younger, but not by much. If you were to go back to the elections of the 1970s, if we were to apply the theory that boomers were dominant and voting for left-wing causes, what the hell was Fraser about? How did he get elected? Right? Sure, Hawke and Keating governments were well, but boomers were on the voters' roll in very, very significant numbers in the 70s as young adults.
So I think that actually what that illustrates is, again, that the long-run class realignment and the shift of educated middle-class Australians and
that's right,
and their ilk across Western societies. It's a fragment of the tertiary educated middle class became progressive. And they have an outsized role in the sort of political and cultural imagination. But as you're pointing out, when you actually look at the hard electoral arithmetic, big voice, but the bigger voice is actually made up of the people who did vote for Malcolm Fraser, the people who did vote for John Howard through 1996 to his defeat in 2007. Now, but you've also got some very interesting data. So let's reiterate the numbers we're looking at here. Gen Z plus millennials make up over 43% of the electorate. Boomers now 31%. Take us through some of the data which you've extracted, fascinating data from your key seats track, which you ran through the recent federal election.
When we look at the voting behaviour of younger Australians, it's not that they are, as we've touched on before, turning progressive. Yes, there's an element that there are doing that, but it's the rejection of the orthodoxy. So when we look at Gen Z, the combined major party vote barely scratches 50%. It grows to about 64% with millennial, and it grows further with Gen X, and then it balloons out to plus 80% with baby boomers and older Australians.
Yeah, so 64% for millennials, they're voting for the majors, 80% for boomers.
That's
and
right.
again, your data, it looks like Gen X are missing. But is Gen X sort of halfway between the
Gen X
millennials and boomers?
Yeah, it's a Gen X about 67%.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the other big thing that you've tracked there is it's the other vote. It's the other vote that's risen exponentially from 14% in 1996 to 34% in 2025.
Yeah, just below that now after all the votes have been counted, but it's still very significant. And of the other votes, 72% of it is made up of millennial and Gen Z.
Mm.
So increasingly, these younger Australians are enrolling to vote. And every cycle, there's 700,000 of them, and they are choosing minor parties. And to a lesser extent, Greens and the Labor Party as well. So, look, the message out of this is that, going back to the initial
and where
point
are their preferences going, Cos? Because that's the critical thing, isn't it?
Yeah. But going back to the initial point around the impact that they're having on a whole range of institutions in this country, from advertising to industries that are now struggling to stay financially viable, that same impact is just as profound in politics.
Yeah.
And I don't think conservative politics in this country have fully wrapped around their head the problem they now face. And that is, it is existential. The notion, and I've heard them sometimes say this, where they say, well, look, all we need to do is win them back. You never had them. They never voted for you. They don't plan to. And why is that? There's a whole range of theories out there. They are obviously a generation of Australians who are not entering the housing market like older Australians used to have done in the past. They are not accumulating wealth in the same way. But I think we also cannot, cancel out here the impact that the world they've grown up in, and that is one of global connectivity. They just look at the world differently. For example, Gen Z know more about American politics than know about Australian politics, right? Their focus is on global, not local, and so it's not unusual to find evidence that they are just not buying the conservative playbook in this country. And I think the sort of reform that the Liberal Party has to go through to appeal to this generation is going to be significant, has to be significant.
Yeah, it's a big challenge to throw out there for the non-Labor conservative side of politics. It's not like this problem just emerged in 2025.
No.
They were, this has emerged over a number of electoral cycles, and they kept it. In a sense, they kept kicking the can down the road. And in 2022 should have been the big wake-up call.
Yeah, it started then. Yeah, it was peaking then. It started to peak about that time, and it will get worse now, and they'll go by the way of the pubs and clubs relying on TAB royalties. They'll go by the way of those relying on a business that sells TV sets only, and that's why I'm using those analogies, because their impact is going to be just as profound. And that is, if you're not actually serious about understanding this generation, you're going to find it really difficult in future elections. Now, I think they don't want to understand them, because you've got to think about most people that are now activists within the conservative side of politics. They've been brought up on a diet that has been very, very much welcomed by baby boomers. And And they've created this caricature of the country which basically belongs in the 1980s, in 1970s, or, early 2000s with Howard Spattlers. That's not the world that we're operating in.
Yeah, you're talking about, you use a lovely phrase, this is a generational reimagining of politics.
Yes.
We're talking about, seismic trends, an earthquake. This is not just, occasional volatility. And one of the things you talk about, and this is something we spoke about with Emma Dawson last week, in particular in regards to Anthony Albanese's National Press Club address, is the institutional trust gap. And Albo talked about trust in institutions and trust in government and wanting to restore that trust. We can overcomplicate things, but here is it put simply, and I'll get you to sort of explain in more depth for our listeners. Boomers got security. Gen Z and millennials got insecurity. Housing insecurity, unaffordability, job precarity, climate anxiety, institutional failure. Of course, Gen X, again, we, sad people, we miss out. We get a bit of both, I guess.
Get a bit of both.
Gen Y plus Z, they're not just disengaged, they're cynical as hell and living in what you describe as a really different reality shaped by those kind of techno-scientific changes, just the way that they relate to people, and they don't leave that, they don't socialise in the same ways. They're getting their news and knowledge and, the very shaping of their sort of political, social and cultural realities from a completely different universe to Gen X and boomers.
That's right. You're seeing that permeate right through the entire entertainment TV industry, the impact that's having. You're even seeing that, again, we'll go back to politics, about how, for example, the Conservative side of politics tried to engage in the recent federal election campaign. They still relied on legacy media a lot, right, to try to win this election. And that's basically, screaming into a void or vacuum. There's no one there listening to you because the people that you're trying to convince are off.
Yeah, much better coming on a podcast. This
correct.
Point about cynicism. And it's hard to engage people. One of the things Trump, in lead up to the last US election, he appeared on a hell of a lot of podcasts. Yeah. Joe Rogan, there's the other character, I can't quite remember his name, he's got the mullet. And it was actually one of the most interesting interviews I've ever seen Trump do.
Yeah.
Because he...
Von, I think it is.
So, yes. It's the only time I've listened to Trump and there was a sort of glimpse at his really human side, because he was speaking about addiction and he's speaking about how he lost his younger brother to alcoholism, and it's a great platform. We have to say it's a great platform. And Curtin Cast, one of the leading Australian political and cultural podcasts. He actually did grab some young people. What he was tapping into was that anti-establishment mood, which we've been discussing at length. Now, it's quite interesting because I'll raise The Economist again. They had a really interesting lead article this week talking about how he was able to attract a lot of young people, young working class people and young ethnic voters in America, but they've really quickly flipped. And that again comes back to your point about volatility.
Yes. Yeah, correct. They are not ideologically stuck to one political movement or the other. That's the other thing that we know about, younger Australians, for example, and in the United States and the UK even. And that is, if you offer them a genuine alternative to the establishment, again, they're in the business of ripping things down, not building things up, because they think that the system's stacked against them. So in the US, Trump comes along, he obviously offers them in their view, a genuine anti-establishment offering.
Yeah.
You go to the UK with reform, recently just absolutely smashed it in the local government elections in the UK. Labor got absolutely annihilated there. So did the Conservatives, though. So Liberal Democrats and Reform have done really, really well. And again, if you look at the data, it's driven largely by younger, residents of the UK. So what we see is constantly evidence of this generation churning things up. Here in this country, as we touched on, it's a little bit different. But again, the overall, the overall point that we're discussing here today is the seismic impact that this generation is going to have on the body politic in this country is going to be profound, but it's going to extend into the corporate world. It's going to extend into how advertising's done, how free-to-air functions and survives into the future. And anyone who is in the business of selling things, making money, managing society has to wrap their heads around just how difficult these generations are going to be to attract, build trust with, and bond with as well.
Yeah, and there are risks for the left of politics as well. And I guess I take your point. People are not ideologically, these generations, combined generations, are not ideologically tribal. They don't think of the world in terms of left, right. They're not, they have a more global mindset. They're often more socially liberal. But the key thing is anti-establishment. But there are risks for the left as well. And I think, interestingly, the US Democrats and the Liberal Party here in Australia in many ways face the same challenge, certainly from a leadership perspective, as to who are they going to offer up at the next election. To me, and I think you're going to concur here, what the person they need to embody their brand and reimagine their brand perhaps is an outsider who talks the language of anti-establishment politics. I'm not quite sure how either the US Democrats or the Liberal Party of Australia can actually manage that challenge.
The problem is that we are talking about political institutions that have built brands, careers off the back of the baby boomer generation, which historically was predictable. We know how they vote, and these days obviously they are very conservative. They become extremely conservative as they become older. Very different to younger people as they progress through life. Yeah, producing that
home ownership is the key there, isn't it, Cozzy?
One of them.
But as Greg Connolly, there was a really great article from a guy called Nick Fabry in the Australian the other week, and Gray's been onto this for a long time. Perhaps Gray's also falling into the trap of thinking that things can go back to normal. But Gray does make a good point that if young people, if any generation has nothing to conserve, starting with that key asset of home ownership, why would they be attracted to conservative politics?
Yeah, I think he's partly correct there, but I think the problem goes much deeper than that. I think we're going back to, these are generations that have grown up with that level of connectivity and connection to a global world which no other generations have experienced in human history. You cannot discount that. The sociological impact that's had, I think, is yet to be properly analysed. And I think that's what's really driving it. And asset ownership is one element to it. Education is another element to it. But I think, we are dealing with something quite complex, quite structural and seismic. And, perhaps home ownership will, in some part, fix some of that problem. You'll get some of them back. Not back, but get them back to voting conservative like their parents. But I think that's the problem that the conservative side of politics now face in this country is just as profound as the one that they confronted the Whigs in the UK.
Their big problem with voters under the age of 40, it's a bit like the Whigs. It was a sudden collapse. There was long-term structural causation at play there. And one of the things which I think underlines the conservative confusion was the voice referendum. And again, I don't think there were voices out there, pardon the unintentional pun, who said what's happened with the defeat of the voice referendum was a Pyrrhic victory. Okay, so they scored a tactical win over progressive politics team Elbow, and it did wound Elbow for a while. I've made the point previously that it was actually what that did was, it didn't actually wake up the labour forces at the time, but ultimately it put them back on the track to focusing on a material agenda. But for the conservative side of politics, it was a Pyrrhic victory. And I think you argue that it deepened that generational fault line and is really critical to understanding what happened in 2025.
Yeah, the conservatives...
Just explain for listeners. Can you just quickly break down the demographic split, the demographic breakdown of the voice referendum?
Yeah, I mean, there are two elements to it. Obviously, it's outer urban regional constituencies voted no in a very big way, and inner urban university-educated constituencies voted yes in a very big way, to put it simply. But then when you look at the data of them more deeply, when you go to the outer suburbs, there was a yes vote, and it was overwhelmingly amongst the Generation Z population, right? And so, again, misreading that result through a lens which is one of race. Let's be blunt here. Many people in the conservative side of politics, they thought, no, that they share my views about First Nations people in this country. Therefore, all I need to do is keep talking about it. In reality, a large chunk of people in the outer suburbs and regions, whether they were young or old, voted no because, well, they didn't know, and they didn't like the establishment telling them that they should change the constitution. Right? It was an anti-establishment FU to the system, right? Because the Yes campaign wrongly set up a mantra that was about where the established social players in Australian society, please accept our proposal.
Exactly, right? Like the Republic referendum in 1999, wasn't it? Because it was just like, I hate the phrase history repeats, history rhymes. That rhymed big time.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
It rhymed big time.
Yeah, correct. And so they took the wrong lessons out of it, to the point that even their pollster took the wrong lessons out of it and used it as a weighting mechanism in their polling.
Yeah, I've seen the shenanigans, but the internal war about their polling has continued. Again, I think maybe you've got more to say here, but even the polling seems to be stuck in an outdated way of doing business.
Yeah, so misreading. The biggest challenge with polling, and even us as pollsters we have, is getting a proper read of younger Australians. We can engage them via online panels and so on, but even then, you're probably not getting the right type of person engaging with your samples. And so normally getting the primary vote is pretty good. I think most pollsters can read that pretty accurately. Where this science now gets challenged is that other vote, because that other vote is extremely volatile. It's sitting on 33-point-something% after this election. 72% of it, as I've touched on before, is Millennial Gen Z, and it is extremely volatile, anti-establishment, and it could do all sorts of things. They could answer the poll and say, yeah, that's my intention. I'm going to vote for so-and-so, when in reality they plan to do exactly the opposite, right?
Yeah, this is what you call, this is the new battleground, isn't it, Cozzy?
That's right.
What you're talking about is the cohort that we used to describe as swing voters. Now,
yes. Yeah.
Again, it's an old way of seeing politics, and it's like anything in life. You form habits, and we'll describe them as swing voters. They're not really swing voters before, but if we are going to use their term, what does a swing voter look like? I think you describe as what a classic swing voter in this new battleground: mid-30s, say 35. They're a renter. They've got a tertiary degree, and they're not mortgage holding tradies. But the big thing here, and the big thing to understand for all sides of politics, is that what it has done is transform the way that class works, and class works in electoral terms. And coming back to our discussion of home ownership, it's now about asset access, not just income. So a tradie could be earning double.
That's right.
What a tertiary educated renter, white collar, tech worker, say producing a podcast. Hello, Patrick. What a wonderful job you're doing. Might be earning double Patrick's salary. Patrick might vote progressive. I hope you are voting progressive, Patrick. Whereas Tony the tradie is voting Liberal or perhaps One Nation.
That's right. And that's the new paradigm we're in. You know, the old swinging voter theory was, and it actually was true, was that particularly the boomer generation and older Australians, there would be a portion of them that would switch sides every couple of cycles. You know, they'll be tired of the incumbent government and want to give the other team a go. That's not how the new swinging voter thinks. The new swinging voter is a lot more anti-establishment, less likely to move between the major parties, more likely to move between minor parties, and more likely to then eventually preference one major party over the other as part of that expression of, you know, rebellion.
And
that's
finally,
the voter.
Moving beyond the majors, you know, this is a big existential contest on the left.
Yes.
Because danger signs for Labor here. The Greens performed poorly at the last election, but we both pointed that out. But it's not like their vote collapsed. They performed poorly. I think in retrospect, Adam Bandt, terrible leader, but they've got a core knowledge class base who look a lot like those swing voters that we're talking about, who are asset poor, not necessarily any hell of a lot of money, socially liberal, globally connected.
And diverse too.
And diverse. So I think you've made the point that Labor holds that sort of generational Gen Y, Z loyalty for now, because in 2025 it was seen as being pragmatic and competent enough.
Yeah.
But these young voters are not rusted on Labor voters. And in fact, in a sense, and this is complicated when you look at inner versus middle and outer suburbs, but the Greens have a values alignment with much of this young cohort, but at this point, limited reach. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Geographic inefficiency.
Yeah.
Well, that's how we could sum up the Greens' problem. So they have strong levels of support amongst Generation Z, where in our polling, it's up to into the 30s. They, in fact, outpoll both major parties amongst Gen Z, the Greens, right? So this generation we'll be talking about, they are a lot more green than people appreciate, but they are not, you know, in big enough numbers yet to make an impact. That's going to change. Now, the question is, will Gen Z continue to vote Green as they get older? Well, the data point that we do have is millennial, and that is the millennials, as they've gotten older and they're moving into their 30s and late 30s, they've gone from voting Green to voting Labor. Yeah. So that, yes, they have become more conservative. Only it's not at the margins. It's at the margins. It's
about that point about competency and pragmatism.
Yes, pragmatism. That's right. They're having kids and they're more concerned about, you know, childcare. They've got other pressures in life, and they're changing their vote. And that's actually what sunk Adam Bandt. The booths in the southern part of his electorate were particularly bad for him, who lives there in very big numbers. Wealthy, progressive millennials.
We can't stress enough just how on guard Labor needs to be. And actually, because I went back, had a look at an article I wrote, and I feel really old, mate, 16 years ago in The Australian. And I actually talked about the analogy between that George Dangerfield's Strange Death of Liberal England, you know, the very quick post-World War I demise of the Liberals. And I said, I applied it to the Greens and Labor. This is 2009.
Hey,
2010. And what it reminds me of is that what you talk about, that geographical limitation for the moment for the Greens, is exactly what, particularly in Victoria, hamstrung Labor in Victoria for a very, very long time. So what early Labor did really well in inner Melbourne, inner industrial working class strongholds, North Melbourne, Richmond, Brunswick, Collingwood, Carlton, okay? But its vote was locked up in a handful of key seats, and it struggled to break out to the middle suburbs and the regions. And the greatest contrast there, comparatively speaking, for the Labor parties is New South Wales. New South Wales Labor had broke out of the inner cities, the wharves and the industrial and it didn't have the sort of manufacturing hubs like Melbourne, and did really well in the regions. And that's where Victoria struggled. So
that's right.
You know, if the Greens can get past some of their hubris and arrogance and not wanting to learn from, you know, the lessons of history, and particularly Labor's history, there are insights to be drawn here. And Labor, of course, was compelled. It decided it had faced the existential question: do you want to become a party of government, or do you want to be a minor party which held the balance of power between then the conservative free traders and the liberal protectionists? Do you want to stay there, or do you want to play with the big boys? And it decided it wanted to play with the big boys and wanted to form government.
Just quickly on a bit of a with the UK and the Liberals that basically were there one day and then gone the next after the First World War. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the 1920s, didn't UK change they increased they enfranchised working class people. So before then, you couldn't vote if you didn't own property or something to that effect. Am I wrong here? Or?
No, but no. That had been, you know, women had only actually got the vote, I think, in 1917. So that was.
Yeah, so we are dealing with a period.
But it took UK was behind us in terms of the full full franchise.
That's right.
In fact, even Victoria was a laggard here too, cause you know, Victorian women didn't get the right to vote at a state level until 1908.
Yeah, that's why I always put an asterisk around what happened in the UK around the First World War and post-First World War. We had a massive change in who could vote in that country. And that, I think, played a big role in changing the way their parliament looked. And we saw, obviously, the explosion of the Labor vote in the 1920s, late 1920s in particular. But that influx of voters, I think, is just as profound as it is in Australia. Because if we look over the last 15 years, and for those listening, the migration I'm about to talk about is not the migration that arrived here when Albanese was elected in 2022 and onwards. It's the migration that principally arrived during the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government. That migration has had probably the greatest impact on our body politic in particular the states of New South Wales and Sydney, so in New South Wales and Victoria. And in particular, it applies to the Indian and Chinese diasporas, which are, of course, Millennial and Gen Z, mostly. And they are overwhelmingly voting Labor. And they've, over the period of that 10-year period, and again, those conservatives listening, if you want to blame someone about the voters' roll being stacked with migrants, that's the coalition's fault, because it's their migration policy that has resulted in effectively 1 in 18 Melburnians having an Indian ancestry.
Yes, and I'll leave it with a final historical analogy, Cos, which has just occurred to me. Again, for conservatives, if you're wondering why you have a problem with those diaspora populations, particularly young diaspora populations, it's not them, it's you. And here's another insight from the way the two-party system used to work. One of the great mythologies around, and Judy Brett, one of the best political historians in this country, she overturned one of the historical understandings, that was that working class, that Irish Catholics historically voted for Labor because they were simply working class and their social justice values from their Catholicism aligned with Labor. She said it's more complex than that. She said they're not all working class. She said actually one of the big things which drove them not only to vote for Labor, but to join the ALP and become activists was the sectarianism from the waspy middle class
100%.
Protestant liberals, and you can see echoes now in the way that the Conservatives had a problem with the diaspora. I think it's a terrific analogy, because
it's an excellent analogy there, Nick, because when we were interviewing young Indian Australians who were going to vote in 2025, and they walked us through their values, the wealth accumulators. We asked them about, well, what do you think about the affordability crisis? Yeah, I'll just work harder. What's your aspiration? Oh, I want to own property. Everything they talked to us about screams Liberal voter. So at the end of the session, we said to them, so why aren't you voting Liberal? I said, oh, they don't like us. It's as simple as that. They do not like us. Because, of course, the last 20 years, Conservative politics have been anti-immigration, anti-Southeast Asian, even to as late as the last week of the election, where we were having, again, racial stereotypes out there around who was working on what campaigns. Did not help the coalition one little bit.
Correct, Armando. Cos Samaras, but what a fantastic, really interesting discussion. Our sad, beleaguered Gen X seemed to miss out much of the conversation, but it is what it is, and we're going to talk to another millennial next week. I'm really, really excited to talk to David Swift about his new book, Scouse Republic, which is a new and very lively history of the working class city of Liverpool. We're going to talk to Swifty next week. But for now, Curtinistas, thank you for listening. Make sure to refer a mate. You can hit Curtin's Cast streaming on Apple, Spotify and YouTube. But until next week, it's ciao and arrivederci.